So I'm here to persuade you to stay behind afterwards to talk about Immanuel Kant, who out of the three is arguably the most boring, I think. This is a man that barely ventured more than perhaps a few miles away from the town in which he was born, raised, lived and worked. I'm pretty sure he had very few amorous relationships. He was not a rock and roll philosopher. He was a man thoroughly dedicated to the life of the mind. So if you can stomach that, I would stay around afterwards. What is enlightenment? Like everything else Immanuel Kant wrote, because he never left the place. It was written in Königsberg. This is a town which was then in the Kingdom of Prussia, and now it's in a Russian province called Kaliningrad, nestled between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic coast. Many people have anticipated this being a kind of key fault line in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Anyway, my point is that this is a town that's far away, I think, from the bustling thoroughfares of the Enlightenment, the main centre of the Enlightenment in France, and to a lesser extent England and Scotland, where figures and movements, battled it out in print, fought in cafes and salons and in other kind of institutions of a then kind of growing sort of Enlightenment public sphere. So not only was it written far away from kind of the centre and kind of the vital centre of Enlightenment, it was also written late. It was written in 1784, that is towards the end of the historical period, beginning roughly in the 17th century, which is often referred to as the historical Enlightenment. That means basically that these kind of big socio-political moments of the Enlightenment, from the Dutch Revolt, the English Civil War, and the American Revolution, the probably only exception is probably the French Revolution, they're all in Kant's rear-view mirror, as are the Enlightenment's kind of key intellectual and cultural achievements, from the scientific revolution to the work of many notable figures and movements, from the French encyclopedists to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's arguably the greatest influence on Kant, John Locke and David Hume and so on. In other words, this little essay, which is attempting to define Enlightenment, is spatially and temporally distant, I think, from the actual cut and thrust of the historical Enlightenment. And I think this distance is important because it allows Kant, it provides him with a vantage point, I think, a way in which he can view what he calls the Age of Enlightenment almost as a whole, and then almost abstract and distill the essence of this period. And what is the essence of Enlightenment? Well, what is this kind of distilled I want to say residue, but that kind of sounds really unpleasant. What is this kind of distilled essence of the Enlightenment? And for Kant, of course, its core achievement, the centre of the essence of the Enlightenment is autonomy. That is the central principle of the Enlightenment. It is the development of the capacity for self, auto, self-government, and self-lawmaking. So that's auto, meaning self, nomos, law. So it's the development of the capacity for self-government. That is the key legacy and the key essence of the Enlightenment for Kant. So this is what the Enlightenment means for Kant. It refers to the process. It's not a thing, the Enlightenment. He's not really talking about it as a historical period. He's bothered about what it means almost philosophically and conceptually. It is the process by which individuals learn to reason for themselves. The process by which they learn to judge and decide how to act. Indeed, how to live for themselves. So enlightenment is the process by which we become self-governing. It's the process by which we become autonomous, or as Kant famously puts it in that opening paragraph, Sapere Aude. Have I pronounced that correctly? Yes, I've been desperately looking that up on YouTube, and I've got all sorts of strange accented pronunciations, which of course means have the courage to use your own understanding, says Kant. That is the motto of the Enlightenment. And because the Enlightenment for Kant involves individuals authorising their own actions, it also challenges, therefore, the extant authorities, those authorities, of course, which are authorising people's actions otherwise. It challenges the dukes and priests of Kant's time, just as it challenges, I think, the paternalists and technocrats of our own time. It means to be enlightened means moving away from all those who make decisions on our behalf, who effectively think and judge for us. For Kant, it's the pastor who serves as my conscience, it's the physician who determines my diet for me. And today we might add to Kant's list, kind of diversity trainers, parenting guides, emotional intelligence consultants, and all the other kind of raft of therapeutic experts who set out to determine how we should think and how we should act. So to become autonomous, to become enlightened in our time, is to challenge this expert class, I think, just as it was in Kant's time to challenge this kind of priestly class. Now, it's worth, I think, moving away a little bit from the What is Enlightenment essay to look briefly at his groundwork of the metaphysic of morals, which he wrote in 1785. And I think it's important to look at this in the context, in relation to What is Enlightenment, because it's there, I think, that he fully conceptualizes his idea of individual autonomy. He argues there that we are capable of becoming autonomous insofar as we are rational beings. That means we're capable of doing something that, say, animals are not. I love animals, by the way. This isn't an anti-animal lecture. Animals are subject almost entirely to the laws of nature, writes Kant. They act according to their instinct. Actually, Rousseau's useful here. As Rousseau put it, nature commands every animal and beasts obey. But rational beings are different. We still feel the same impetus, writes Rousseau. We still have instincts and appetites and so on. But Rousseau continues, we are free to go along or to resist. And that freedom, I think, to choose, which is enabled by reason for Kant because we're rational beings, that freedom to go along or resist, that freedom to choose is enabled by reason. That is, we are subject to the laws of nature. But we're also capable as rational beings of acting according to the laws of reason. We're capable of not acting according to the laws of nature. And these laws of reason, these are laws that we as rational reasoning beings are making ourselves. I think that's the key point. As rational beings, then, we are our own lawmakers. And this ability to be self-governing, to act according to laws which we ourselves have authored, which is the very definition of autonomy, allows us, argues Kant, to be free. Indeed, freedom, the idea of freedom, and Kant writes a lot about the idea of freedom, is absolutely central to the idea of, to the concept of autonomy. As Kant puts it, freedom is then the property of a being that is a law to itself. A property of a being that is a law to itself. And Kant pushes on from this. He argues that this capacity for acting freely, this capacity for being a law to ourselves, this capacity to act according to laws which we ourselves have authored, he says, this is the condition for morality. That is, as reasoning, thinking beings, we're free to decide not just how to act, but to decide and judge how we, and this is the key word, ought to act. To judge not just what we would like to do, or what we feel we might want to do, but to judge and decide what we ought to do. To judge for ourselves what would be the morally right thing to do. Now, Kant, of course, famously even comes up for a handy formula for working out how we ought to act, known as the categorical imperative. I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law, which is certainly something to keep in your pocket if you're ever struggling to work out how to act in any particular situation. That is, when judging for ourselves how to act, we should imagine ourselves, this is what I think Kant means, we should imagine ourselves as if we are legislating, as if we are making laws for all other rational beings, beings like ourselves. We are making this law according to a law that all rational beings ought to themselves follow in our situation. We are legislating, when we are deciding how to act, we are also deciding how all other rational beings ought to act in a certain situation. Now, Kant's conception of moral autonomy, I think, is arguably more... Actually, I've skipped a bit here, which is very important. I'm going to go back to it. Now, when he's talking about conceiving of ourselves almost as universal lawmakers, of imagining ourselves when deciding and judging how to act, as if we were judging and how to act for all other rational beings, he then starts to extrapolate and imagining almost like an ideal world in which you have a society consisting entirely of these kind of rational, autonomous beings. And he calls and this would be a world of almost like universal lawmakers. Imagine all of us, every single moment, were like legislating as if we were acting for all of mankind. I know, I can see quite a few of you are thinking, is that plausible? Probably not. But anyway, this is Kant's ideal. This is the kingdom of ends. Now, we've never really come close to that, to be honest. And I'll level with you, I don't think we ever will. I think it also sounds pretty much like hard work. Now, Kant's conception of moral autonomy, I think, is arguably more challenging today than it was in the late 18th century. Largely, I think, because this conception of a morally autonomous, rational being cuts against so much of contemporary culture. Today, I think we're encouraged not to be autonomous, not to be self-governing, to act according to the laws of reason. We're encouraged instead to be, I think, authentic. We're encouraged to express and follow our feelings, to act within certain limits according to our desires. You know, we're encouraged not to, I think the idea of self-government, I think would probably be demonised or stigmatised as something like repression. I think it would be seen as, to be self-governing, I think would probably be seen as, you know, being sort of self-repressed. You know, repression is bad. Letting it all hang out is probably is good. You know, you're encouraged to sort of talk about and be yourself and so on. You're encouraged to emote. You're encouraged less to reason, but to emote. You know, to give vent to your feelings, to give vent to your emotions. You know, and to actually to suggest that someone shouldn't be doing that. You know, you're accused of invalidating their feelings, invalidating their emotions. So we live in a culture which I think cuts against everything that Kant's idea of moral autonomy points towards. As I say, in fact, I think it's the very opposite of Kant's conception of moral autonomy. For Kant, acting according to our inclinations, you know, acting according, you know, because we feel like doing something, pursuing actions, if you like, because they make us feel good, make us feel esteemed, make us feel recognised, is not to act morally, regardless of the effects of these actions. And that's because for Kant, such behaviour is simply not autonomous. It's giving in, it's an act of giving in, if you like, to inclination, an act of giving in to feelings. And in that moment of giving in, I think, one ceases to be self-governing. One ceases to be determining one's own course of action according to reason. And you know, at that moment, one ceases to be deciding how one ought to live according to morality. Instead, in allowing ourselves to be governed by feeling, by inclination, we are being governed by something other than our own reason. We're being governed, as Kant puts it, by alien causes. Indeed, for Kant, an action's moral worth, I think, is greater the more one feels inclined not to pursue it. And I think that this leads to quite a striking formulation. He says actually almost like the moral sublimity of an action is greater the more subjective inclinations are pushing against it. So to act morally is almost to do to act morally is to do what one ought to do, regardless of whether we feel inclined not to do, whether we feel inclined not to do it. That's why I think the most morally sublime acts, the most morally kind of impressive acts, are precisely the ones that cost the actor so much. You know, think of sacrificing yourself to save another person, or of giving up one's own happiness, if you like, to do what one ought to do by another person. These are kind of morally sublime acts for Kant, precisely because they work against one's inclination to do otherwise. They work against one's inclination to perhaps please oneself, or to do something because it makes them feel better. Now, today I think such morally sublime actions, such as deciding to put one's own life at risk to rescue someone, they would no doubt sort of violate health and safety protocols or something like that. So they cut against the very sort of, they cut against the culture, the therapeutic culture, but also the kind of restrictive regulatory culture in which we live. So we're certainly a long way from Kant's ideal of autonomy, certainly Kant's ideal of moral autonomy. But I never like to sort of end these kind of lectures on a downbeat note, largely because I feel I've got quite a miserable voice. So when I end on a downbeat note, I always think I'm just instilling a sense of doom and depression. We'll wait for the counter-enlightenment for that. We are not without hope, I think, certainly according to Kant. So returning to that what is Enlightenment lecture, Kant is well aware of how far we are away from a society of morally autonomous beings. Of course, elsewhere he writes of the crooked timber of humanity from which one has to cultivate oneself, from which one has to cultivate one's capacity for reasoning for ourselves. So, contrary to the image of kind of Enlightenment figures, Kant being a principal one, them just being all kind of gormless optimists, thinking things are always getting better. They have a very realistic idea of the state of the world and the state of morality, and the extent to which reason has been cultivated in society. And Kant doesn't give up, of course, because he provides a hint of what can be done or of what ought to be done. He says that people, of course, must be allowed to exercise their reason publicly. They must be allowed to think and question and act for themselves without the guardrails and restrictions provided by extant authorities. And of course, we'll make mistakes. We won't always do the morally right thing. But it's only through the exercise of one's reason, only through the exercise of one's freedom, I think, that we can actually cultivate a sense of freedom, that we can actually start to cultivate a sense of autonomy. So it's only through being allowed to act and exercise those capacities do we actually start to develop and cultivate them. So it's only through trying to be autonomous that we can actually become autonomous. We have dragging ourselves up by our own bootstraps. So for Kant, you have to have a society which starts to provide at least a minimal amount of freedom to question and to think for yourselves. And I think that today, right now, I think that's an incredibly important lesson. I hope that kind of ends it on a more positive or upbeat note than otherwise, where we all say, crikey, it's going to be impossible to live up to Kant's kingdom of ends, which all act as universal legislators for all of mankind.